Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you guys are at. I hope you're having a fantastic day. It's SoulSaint here, and I wanted to talk to you guys about something that's coming up that's actually kind of really interesting in terms of the Layers terrain, for lack of better words. We got two updates that we're gonna talk about today. We have two champions, and if you guys aren't already familiar with the news or you haven't heard anything about it, let it be known. Great Hoof Loriaca, as you see right about here, as well as Jingwon, who I believe is a Shadowkin champion. They're both in for a rework, a buff, in their news. So I'm going to go ahead and break down each champion individually, and then I'll tell you what their updated versions of these abilities are going to be. And from there, we'll kind of give our consensus of whether or not this is a good change or a bad change or anything in between, all right? So with that being said, Great Hoof Loriaca, what are we dealing with? So, the notes that they set for us right here says, with the rebalance of Great Hoof Loriaca, our main goal was to shift her focus on providing more utility aid for the team in PvE battles with the help of new buffs and debuffs in her skill set, as well as getting even more turn meter boost. So, let's look at her. I think the biggest thing that we remember seeing, I remember about her, was the fact that she did have turn meter boosting, but also a block debuff buff that she brings to the table on a 3-turn cooldown, which can be useful depending on if you can get the turn meter speed tune right. Now, with that being said, her A1 has a 40, when fully booked, 50% chance of stealing one buff per each hit. So that means she can steal up to 2 buffs worth from the enemy that she hits. And then she also has an attack all enemies has a 75% chance, which can be booked up to 100% chance of placing a decreased resistance debuff for 2 turns. Then also fills this champion's turn meter for each decreased res that's placed by the skill. So if you're going against 4 enemies, then you get decreased resistance, that's 40% turn meter, and so on and so forth, right? And then of course the A3, which is what the block debuff was. She also gets a failed turn meter by 5% each time an ally buff is removed, transferred, or stolen, or expired. So basically, as buffs are being replaced or they're falling off or getting removed, she starts cranking up a notch, right? Now, for her A1, her Deprive is also going to now, instead of just having the chance of stealing the buff, according to our notes here, it says that she's going to be able to fill the turn meter by 10% for each buff stolen. So, this steal, if she hypothetically was able to get 2 debuffs stolen, or two buffs stolen, excuse me, she would net 20% overall. So, like, for each buff she steals, it's 10% each time. Also, her Great Hoof Stampede, which is going to be her A2, is also going to place a decreased accuracy debuff for 2 turns. And then it fills this champion's turn meter by 10% for each debuff placed by this skill. So it's going to change this little text right here. It's going to add decreased accuracy. And then, of course, it's going to place those 2 debuffs for every single debuff that's placed in general. It's going to be a increase by 10%. So hypothetically speaking, if she was going against like Hydra, for example, which is where I would be interested in maybe seeing this play, 4 debuffs times 2 is 8. 8 times 10 is 80% turn meter. So she gets a lot of turn meter from this ability if she were to land the debuffs across the board. So it has like a lot of potential and a lot of capability from it. But I will say, we'll see if there's going to be some case usage somewhere in terms of those abilities. Now, her Dance of War, which is the A3, is also now going to add increased accuracy buff on the ability, as well as the block debuffs, where the turn meter is also going to be filled by 20%, so that doesn't change. The only thing is we're going to net increase accuracy for 2 turns, so it's going to be another buff in addition to that. That's pretty much the long and short of her abilities and whatnot. So my first thought is this. Is it good? I think the turn meter gains are interesting. I do feel like one of the biggest issues when it came to using her in a key area, which was like not Hydra, but like Demon Lord Clan Boss, was that speed tuning her and adjusting her in accordance with the fact that, she gains turn meter at certain intervals and whatnot as buffs are going on and whatnot, right? As well as her own abilities. It was very hard to speed tune, right? Not impossible, but I never really, myself personally, I never really went out of my way to build a team with her in mind, trying to incorporate block debuffs or trying to incorporate her turn meter boosting that she brought to the table. This new addition of buffs or rework to her abilities are going to basically make it even more complicated, and I won't deny that. But that's not something that's insurmountable, so I don't think that that's a complete shut off in that area. But in terms of using decreased resistance and then for that matter decreased accuracy, where would those buffs be applicable? And that's where my first conversation for you guys will be at. Is this not irresistible? So like she has to have accuracy herself to land those debuffs, and if you need decreased resistance so that you can land your debuffs, it automatically raises the equation. It's kind of like self neutralizing in a sense. It's like you need the accuracy to place this debuff so that you can have less of a need for accuracy to place debuffs. You know, it kind of seems like it's counterintuitive in a sense, right? However, she does bring that extra increased accuracy now to the table, which makes this a little bit more substantial, a little bit more potent, and that's not too bad. Now, here's where it can kind of get interesting, and I'm gonna throw in a scenario here. We're gonna talk PvP for a second. So, where is increased accuracy very valuable? Well, when you're trying to land debuffs. What are some substantial debuffs that you're trying to land inside a PvP environment? My first one was bombs. So, we have champions like Lady Kimmy, for example, who places increased accuracy, I believe, as well as the turn meter boost on her A3. And also has a chance to remove a buff from the enemy, which is like a pseudo strip. So, a lot of value there, along with the turn meter boost. This now has the opportunity that if you do land someone like Loriaca and you want to partner with maybe Nishak, for example, to land those debuffs, then she can provide that increased accuracy along with the turn meter boost, which is actually 5% more than Lady Kimmy, as we just saw. Now, we don't net the increased speed there, but it is a alternative option is probably the best way to say it, right? And then it also protects you as well from getting CC'd by having that block debuff in place. So that is a check. I'll give that as like a special nod. Is it the end all be all? She has a base speed of 105. She has no aura. There may be better. Like Lady Kimmy, for example, may just be better. So like she is a viable option, maybe not the top end one for a suitable speed team to include a bomb champion. Let's talk PvE. The only area that I can think of where landing debuffs is very substantial, I think of Hydra right off the rip. But even then, though, for the amount of effort it takes for you to build up and incorporate a champion like this, you have to have that slot or these slots that you use these champions, and you only have 6 for Hydra, where they bring value to either the team or to the fight, in a sense, right? Decreased resistance is not mandatory to be able to do what you need to do in a PvE environment like Hydra. As a matter of fact, you just have to hit the accuracy thresholds. And if you can't hit those, more often than not, bringing in something like increased speed could be valuable. So maybe not so much her A2, but maybe her A3 may bring some value there. Now, here's another complication to it, is that block debuffs is something that's tumultuous, I would say. It's good and bad in the environment that is Hydra, because it's good whenever you want to mitigate certain debuffs, but it doesn't mitigate every debuff. Like, for example, one of the more annoying debuffs or the mechanics in the fight of Hydra is dealing with the Torment Head, the Fears, right? Well, the Fears don't care about block debuffs, so this buff becomes less relevant. Also, if you're dealing with champions that are mischief tanking, so trying to avoid losing your debuffs when you have one that has your designated champion that's going to have high resistance, having block debuffs on your entire team may be something that could be counterintuitive along with decreased accuracy. If that champion uses one of those buffs as like I'll give an example of in the same faction, Coronar, I believe he buffs himself with block debuffs and increased defense, which makes him a viable option for being a mischief tank. That could be a very malnutritious approach, because now you're giving one of the isolated buffs that he gives himself to everybody, right? And that's counterintuitive. Now, with that being said, decreased accuracy, which is also going to be placed on this ability when the update goes live, is a blessing because it makes your resistance requirements lower for the builds outside of Loriaca. So that is a boon for, utilizing this champion, in the sense of like lowering the mischief head means that you have a higher likelihood to build resistance, and maybe you can incorporate your builds to be on par with that as a byproduct of that. Maybe you increase resistance, or you just build their builds in mind to have also some resistance on there. Is that worth it, though? I think nowadays, depending on where you're at in the game, there may be some value behind just building more effectively your team, or building and incorporating mechanics like block buffs, for example, to mitigate that output. So even if they do steal the buffs, it's not being spread, it's not going attached to the mischief head, so the mischief head is managed in a sense, right? I do feel like in terms of decreased resistance, I just don't see it yet. I don't see it as big of a value in using an ability like this, because it requires you to still build into accuracy in mind. So I have a very negative connotation towards decreased resistance, but maybe I'm not seeing the full picture. Is there an area that you feel like decreased resistance has value that maybe I'm not perceptive of? I'm all ears. I'm trying to think if there's anything else in particular that could do that. But like, honestly, the only thing that I think that's very valuable from the A2 is definitely decreased accuracy. The increased accuracy buff on the A3 is nice in tandem with those two, so I think that's okay. I'm good with those. Maybe if they had like increased resistance also on this to make it so that like you increase your resistance and lower the enemy's accuracy, meaning that you're mitigating a lot of the control that would come from maybe a mechanic like Hydra, or a composition that requires Hydra. You have to be conscious of it, right? So I don't know. I'm curious. Do you guys feel like Loriaca is going to be a plug and play in certain areas? I think my answer is no. I think that there's champions that could do what she does better than what she currently does, but I don't think that she's necessarily a bad alternative option if you're someone who's progressing the game that doesn't have access to all the champions that are very, very enticing, right? So if you don't have that Lady Kimmy, but you have a Loriaca, maybe you could use that in a comp to maybe further bolster your PvP team for Nishek, just as an example. Also, if there's any other areas that you think that she may be viable in, let me know. I'm actually very curious, It's an open dialogue, right? Now, we have one more champion that we're going to talk about, which is going to be Jingwon. He is someone that I remember using for the sake of transferring all the debuffs to the dragon. So as like a dragon hard 10 killer. He'd be like one of the boss killer options you can use, along with like maybe the Stultus, in that same likeness, in that same tier. With them, they notified us and they said, with the upcoming changes, Jingwon's role will shift from it being an HP tank towards more of a support type champion. His rework kit will grant Jingwon more control over his enemies, with chances to land stuns, an additional AoE attack that prolongs debuffs, a chance to remove all enemy buffs, and finally more useful debuffs in his arsenal. So he's going to be more utility oriented. Now, I'm going to break down his kit first at what it currently is, and then we'll talk about what it's going to change down to. So, Doom's Exchange, his A1 is going to attack one enemy and transfer all debuffs from this champion to the target. The A2 attacks one enemy, and then it has a 75% chance to increase the duration of all debuffs on that target by 1 turn. He also places block active skills, as well as decreased accuracy and decreased crit damage. If they are block active if they're under decreased accuracy or decreased crit damage, which is where the A3 comes into play, because it places that. Afterwards, it places a strengthen on top of that. So pretty much the main thing is that like you lead with your A3 to place a decreased accuracy, decreased crit damage, and then that opens up the opportunity for you to place block active skills from the A2. His passive is also the immunity to pretty much almost every hard CC in a sense, and even some soft CC. And then, of course, he removes it and replaces those debuffs with a block debuff instead, which is really, really good. You naturally will go against a wave of his in, like, Soul Crossing, where, like, your main control is provoking or freezing or petrifying or using some kind of hard CC to kind of get through the wave. And he's actually, like, a twist in that, and then he forces you to have to play more cautiously with him in mind, because the moment you CC them, they get that block debuff, and next thing you know, you're playing in a battle of attrition where you have to survive through it, right? And there's a lot of different ways people do it, but it's actually kind of annoying. Now, with that being said, he's getting buffed, right? So this transfer buff on his A1 is now going to also have a 50% chance of placing a stun debuff for 1 turn. Then his Compound Calamity is now also going to place a block active debuff and a block buff debuff for 2 turns, with the change that it says attacks all enemies. Now, that's a game changer for accounts if you're not familiar with that, and we'll tell you about why. Now, the only thing is that the base cooldown, or this says the cooldown has been increased to 5 turns. I'm not sure if that's before books or if that's after books, but if we're going before books, then that means it's bookable down to a 3-turn cooldown, whereas this is a 2-turn cooldown in its current iteration. So that's not too bad. This is actually a really big buff for him in the sense of where he becomes viable as an option in other areas of the game. Power Flare, his A3 is now going to have the first hit having an 80% chance of removing all debuffs, or all buffs from all enemies. So that's what it says there with the upgrade. That's what the upgraded version is going to be. The second hit has a chance of placing a 50% decreased accuracy debuff and a decreased 25% crit damage debuff for 2 turns. Also places a 25% strengthen on this champion. Oh no, on all allies actually. It's changing that too. So he's going to be buffing everybody for 2 turns. So very, very interesting upgrade. I want to kind of particularly focus on the A1. The stun is kind of, it's nice for control. It is a 50% chance just a straight up stun is nothing to scoff at. I think if you think about Sun Wukong, who is still hold up pretty well in the meta, he has a 25% chance that's bookable up to a 50% chance, and that sometimes can land, and it's a game changer for the fight itself. It could be that 1 turn you need to win the fight, So giving that to someone like Jingwon, it's not bad. And considering he's void affinity, so he's neutral affinity, makes him really, really good at being able to be mitigative in that sense, or control-oriented with his kit. Now, the A2, which is the thing I think is the biggest upgrade for him, is getting that block active debuff, but also a block buff is really, really cool, and is being placed on all enemies. This is a game changer because block buff, as a debuff, allows people to use maybe someone like Jingwon as a viable mischief, Blighthead, and we're talking about Hydra, for example, where you can kind of control how the buffs are being placed on the enemy, and that's that's one of the biggest control elements of Hydra, is preventing mischief from popping off, which enables the rest of the heads, preventing Blight from putting up Poison Cloud and making sure that nobody can do any debuffs to them, and then other elements that also can be kind of annoying, like dealing with the reflect damage from Suffering and Wrath, and increased attack on Wrath, which makes him do more damage. You want to avoid all that, you really do. So having Jingwon be able to be one of the many options to be able to mitigate the amount of output that would be stressing in Hydra is great. He is now a block buff champion, and I feel like that's really good. That didn't take away from what he's also already good in, which was being a dragon boss killer with being able to transfer debuffs like the poisons that the boss places on you. That's really, really good. He's still viable as that option, but now his kit is being opened up to the opportunity of being able to be more of an element control or an element champion in Hydra, and then you net decrease crit damage or decrease accuracy, which could be really, really cool too. I mean, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good buff for Jingwon, and I like it. I think that makes him a viable Hydra block buff champion. Is that great anywhere else, though? I'm not entirely sure. I do think that, like, from a PvP standpoint, having the ability to place decrease crit damage or decrease accuracy is kind of nice. However, we live in a poly meta where, like, the more debuffs you place, the more susceptible you are to getting polymorph, and he now has 2 abilities that does like a plethora of debuffs across all enemies. And if you're going against nothing but 6-star poly champions, then it's kind of a dangerous game to play. You're playing a lot of factors of him being sheepo. And that could be good or bad depending on how you look at it. Good for you if you're on the poly side. If you're on the side where Jingwon's trying to place those debuffs, it could be an uphill battle that you're creating for yourself, and that's kind of dangerous gameplay. TLDR, nerf, get rid of poly. Forget it at this point. But yeah, that's where we're at with the champions so far. I think these updates are going to be interesting. I like the direction they went with Jingwon. I don't necessarily feel like Great Hoof Loriaca's buff was great enough for me. But as always, I want to open the door for you guys to have a conversation with me on this one. What do you guys think? Do you guys think that these 2 champions are going to be viable in a lot of different ways that maybe I'm not even talking about? I'm all ears. And with that being said, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and as always, always remember, stay ascended.